All right, now joining us on the broadcast, we've got Dr. Malcolm Davis, who's a senior analyst in defense strategy and capability at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and he's joining us live on this broadcast. Dr. Davis, this is a pretty critical moment in the tensions between Iran and Israel. Effectively, the two sides are now in an open war. But the question that I want to ask you is this: how much further do you think the Iranians and the Israelis would like to take this forward?
I think from the Israeli perspective, they clearly want to utterly destroy Iran's nuclear capabilities. They certainly do not want to see Iran get nuclear weapons. So they have a ways to go there in terms of attacking Iranian nuclear facilities. In particular, there's one called Fordo, which is deeply buried, which they need to destroy if they want to make sure that Iran can't reconstitute its uranium enrichment program. The other thing the Israelis want to do, I think, is lay the conditions for some sort of color revolution in Tehran that would see the overthrow of the regime. And I think from the Israelis' perspective, they see the removal of the Iranian regime, a regime change in effect, as solving a whole number of problems in terms of security issues across the region.
Right, regime change, one of the favorite topics of the Americans. We'll get to that in a bit. But I want you to weigh in on what Rafael Grossi, the chief of the IAEA, has said in the past, that striking nuclear facilities of another nation is against international law. He said this in the context of the Russians striking the Ukrainian nuclear facilities. He's also said that in the context of the Israelis, who had repeatedly been saying that they want to strike the Iranian nuclear facilities, and they've now gone ahead and done that. This is a clear violation of international law. How do you see this?
Look, I disagree with that perspective, and I think I understand.
This is the chief of the IAEA. This is Rafael Grossi saying.
Let me finish my point. The Israelis clearly had intelligence that the Iranians were moving ahead to get nuclear weapons. They had sufficient fissile material enriched to such a level that they could have 10 nuclear weapons available within a matter of weeks, which they could then use against the state of Israel. And given the size of Israel and given its highly urbanized nature, it would not take many nuclear weapons to literally wipe Israel off the face of the earth, which is what the Iranians have consistently said they intend to do.
Right.
So from an Israeli perspective, they are doing what they need to do to ensure their own survival, and that is entirely within their right under Article 51 of the UN Charter. So I'm sorry, it doesn't matter what the IAEA head says in this occasion. The survival of the Israeli state takes precedence over his personal opinion.
All right. Now, over the course of the last weeks, there were these talks that were underway, negotiations for which Donald Trump had effectively taken personal responsibility. He had been saying over and over again that he does not want the Israelis to stage a kinetic attack on the Iranian nuclear facilities. He said that diplomacy needs to be given its due place, and he wanted a diplomatic solution. Do you think, in terms of the statements that have since come in, the Israelis had the express consent of the American president in staging these attacks, or has Netanyahu gone ahead and done these attacks on his own?
Look, I think the Americans and the Israelis were aware that the Iranians were not going to sign a negotiated agreement that would deny them an enrichment capability, and enrichment is the path to an Iranian nuclear weapons capability. So I think probably whilst it would have been preferable for some sort of diplomatic solution to be realized that would have denied Iran nuclear weapons and an enrichment capability, if that's not possible, then I think the Israelis did the right thing. And I think from the Trump administration's perspective, the Trump administration probably essentially gave their assent, recognizing that the diplomatic option was dead anyhow.
Interesting. Now, looking at what has unfolded since yesterday night, since the Israelis under Netanyahu went ahead and carried out Operation Rising Lion, do you think Netanyahu calculated the fact that there would be an Iranian response, and now this has effectively pitted the Iranians against the Israelis in what appears to be an all-out war? If the Americans, this is a bit speculative at this moment, do you think the Americans will get dragged into this war, or do you think the Israelis will be left fighting this war on their own against Iran?
Look, I think firstly, no Israeli leader would go into a military crisis without thinking about retaliation, and I think the Israelis perfectly anticipated Iranian retaliation, and that's what we've seen. In terms of the American role in this, it really does depend on Iran's choices here. The ball is in Iran's court. If they attack American assets and American forces in the region, then yes, of course, America will enter the war against Iran, and that will be the end of Iran or the Iranian regime, I should say. If the Iranians hold off from attacking American assets, then I think what the Americans will do is defend Israel, but they won't necessarily go on the offensive against Iran.
I think that's an interesting point that you've made. But so far, looking in terms of how the Iranians have carried out their attacks on Israel all through the night, they have not touched any American military assets that are there in the region. In that case, do you think the Israelis are capable of fighting the Iranians on their own without America's military assistance?
Well, so far they seem to be doing that rather well. And I think that what you are seeing is very effective use of military power to attack not only nuclear facilities, but also key Iranian military leadership. And they've taken out a large number of key Iranian military leaders very effectively. And so the big question in my mind is, will that then set the ground for some sort of popular colour revolution that sees the regime overthrown? If that were to happen, then I think you could see complete success on the Israelis' part. If it doesn't happen, then really at the end of this, even though the Iranian nuclear program is destroyed, we're back to square one in terms of instability in the region.
So at this moment, do you think the possibility of any kind of a negotiated settlement, a deal for the Iranians to have a civilian nuclear program is now completely off the table? Because what is interesting to note is that Donald Trump's position on what Iran could do with its nuclear program changed over the course of the last weeks. He started initially by saying that the only thing that he did not want the Iranians to have was a nuclear weapon. It was okay for them to have a civil nuclear program. Later, his position changed that they could not have even a civil nuclear program. In your assessment, what do you think would be the American position if there were to be talks that were to continue?
Well, Trump didn't say they couldn't have a civil nuclear program. What he said was they couldn't have enrichment, which is the path to nuclear weapons. And I think that if the Iranians were to accept a diplomatic agreement that firstly denied them forever the right to have nuclear weapons, and secondly denied them an enrichment capability, then yes, of course they can have a diplomatic deal that gives them some sort of civilian nuclear program. But the US and the international community should not give Iran the path to the bomb. Simple as that.
Yeah, but the statement was in fact made by Donald Trump's special representative Steve Witkoff, where he said there was nothing nuclear that the Iranians can do. Now, for a many number of years, this is what had been talked about, that the United States would get sucked into a war that would be initiated between Iran and Israel. So there is a war that has started between Iran and Israel. In your assessment, do you think the United States could get sucked into a war that it does not want to fight against the Iranians?
It really does depend on the Iranians. Essentially, if they're stupid enough to attack US forces or US assets in the region, then yes, that happens. Because the Americans will not sit back and have their forces attacked and do nothing. But if the Iranians are sensible, they won't attack US forces, and so the Americans will stay out.
Now, the American deep state has a policy. This is what has been discussed over and over again within the American deep state. The Americans have brought about a regime change. They've done this in Iraq in 2003. They did this later in Libya in 2011, and much later in Syria through their proxies when they took off Bashar al-Assad. And they would want to do it in Iran as well. This is what the American deep state would want to do. Do you think, with a crisis that is now brewing in the region, is there a possibility of an all-out war that could result in a regime change in Tehran? Is that something that the Americans are planning for?
Look, I'm not sure what the deep state is you're referring to there. I'm only referring to here what the official US government talks about. And the official government is that Iran should not be allowed to have nuclear weapons. And certainly the US official defense policy is that if Iran attacks US forces, then they will respond and retaliate, just as any nation would and is allowed to do under Article 51 of the UN Charter.
In your assessment, since yesterday night, who do you think is the aggressor? Because it was Israel that preemptively, if one could say preemptively, staged an attack on Iran's nuclear facilities, which is against international law as per the IAEA. Who do you think is the aggressor here? Because the Iranians are saying that they're just responding.
The Israelis are making clear that they had critical intelligence that the Iranians were planning an attack on Israel in concert with Hezbollah and Hamas. And second point is the Iranians were very close and moving aggressively towards getting nuclear weapons. I think the Israelis were acting in self-defense. Preemptively, yes, but they were acting in self-defense, and that is allowed under the UN Charter of Article 51.
All right, we'll have to leave there. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Malcolm Davis, for joining us with that perspective there.
Thank you.
For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.